So I just watched Fred, that's Conference Report's video called Personal and Political Transparency, and that's a strongly recommended video. I will put a link down in the underbar for that. So much that's going on in that video that I want to get at, and I think part of the problem to maybe address this is to adequately set the context for how privacy came to be. Because I think Fred is really right on so much of this video about the great transition we are facing as we move from the kind of privatized culture that it has become, modern Western culture, into a increasingly public, less privatized, more, you could just call it a kind of spectacle life of, where everything that one does is, I guess, in public, or it lacks the kind of privacy that people have come to enjoy over the last several centuries. I think, part of the issue here is the drift that occurred in ancient societies when people went from collectivist hunter-gatherer societies, which were largely public and egalitarian. People knew each other, there were shared backgrounds, and it is what Nietzsche would say is that whatever brought a harm to the collective activated the sting of conscience in the individual. I mean, the individual interest and the collective interest were so merged that one could say that conscience was still a kind of collective phenomena, and this notion of living in private and hadn't yet really come to pass, and it's sometimes described as a kind of shame culture. That is, wholly public oral societies in their origin have a kind of conscience that comes from the outward in, and it brings people into alignment with the public order that people are sharing. It was only through various communication technologies that people had been liberated into some notion of autonomy, self-sufficiency, independence, the freestanding, isolated individual, and in particular the modern individual who deems himself or herself to be politically and economically independent, subject to forming governments that are, sort of freestanding kind of legislation created by those individuals who are going to, I don't know, set laws for themselves collectively, but collectively by individuals forming collectives and publics. It seems very different. It does have very different tastes and flavors, and I think what people would say is that it's basically the origin of everything from, individual author rights to notions of personal conscience. These things are, they're products of communication technologies, and they're kind of evolutionary developments in Western culture. And there are so many different ways to cut at that. So whereas earlier cultures, oral tribal societies are sometimes called shame cultures, we see modern cultures being something like guilt cultures. And the guilt culture comes from this kind of individual who has been released. Some of this could be seen just maybe just for a second here. If you try to get at the issue of how we think about thought in the ancient world. In the ancient world, people understood thought as argument and dialogue. I mean, if you want to represent thought in the ancient world, what you would have is two people kind of having a dispute, and as a cross-section, that would illustrate what thought is. Today, the very modern, right? I mean, we have the thinker. This notion of the thinker, this is not a classical, ancient piece of art. This is so obviously a modern piece with the idea of thought happening inside the head. It's very post-literacy, and you want to think of it, in the ancient world, thoughts were meant to be had, I guess, in public, in dispute, in debate with one another, and scriptorium, the sort of places that preceded libraries, these were areas where it was, disputatious and loud and argumentative, and that's how you could hear thought was going on. And people would write things down, and the collected notes of Aristotle, some 100 years or so after he had died, Andronicus had compiled these, and we have quotes the works of Aristotle. But there wasn't this person who sat down, composed the Poetics, and then signed it Aristotle and made it available for mass distribution. It wasn't anything like that. I mean, thought itself was embedded in collective practices of something like a kind of community that was deeply shared. Nothing like the private individual citizen that we now know. And again, there's just so much that's going on there in your discussion. Fred has this line where he says something like, live your life as if it were in public. And I always think back to the Seneca line. Seneca has a line where he says, when you speak with men, speak as if God were listening, and when you pray to God, pray as if men were listening. And he sort of captures this, use your imagination to bring to bear how others would hear what you're up to. And because it's imagined, it can be very useful. Now, I think in some ways a lot of the Christian techniques, which are also Stoic techniques, but Christian techniques of vivifying the imagination through a kind of personal conscience and, being able to think about that, right? I mean, when we're able to think about our own behavior as if, I'm not saying that it is, but as if it were being watched, it has a kind of regulatory, or I guess it feels like a sense of conscience there. It would be interesting to ask to what extent people who are on YouTube who claim to be atheists are recovering some of the kind of conscience that a traditional theist claims to have. That is, a Christian theist anyway, I think would likely have something like God is watching them at all points and God knows everything they're doing. It could be that someone could make the argument that some people who are at least on YouTube, who are atheists, who are posting videos, are in like a misdirected or unbeknownst to themselves attempt to recover some of that meaning horizon that comes from the feeling that what one's doing is being watched and is being taken into account and regarded. Now, it does seem to be that there is going to be a problem here, because there's a difference in moving sort of from organismal emergence into self-awareness that was a collective awareness and based in shame, as that emerged into guilt culture of the individual. And even this is a huge global debate between collectivist societies and individualist society. I mean, there's a lot that goes on there. But I think that right now, if we were to, as I guess Fred is suggesting in the video, if we were to move toward a more and more life in public, more and more transparency, what we're going to have to do is, I guess, see to what extent people can't regulate themselves with their own conscience by way of that, whether you want to call it a Foucaultian panopticon effect or a surveillance society, or however you want to get at it. There does seem to be something like maybe a recovery of shame culture, but I don't know if shame culture is what people need. I mean, part of this is to what extent is this recollectivizing people. So there seem to be so many dynamics of coming into public, but we're coming into public from an individual's grounding, a kind of vanity and egocentricity and notions of self-interest that are very different than the earlier traditional notions of living in public, again, like ancient societies. I guess I'll just end with a second recommendation. I picked this up from Peter at Tool Time. He had recommended the movie called We Live in Public, and it was a documentary, and we did get a chance to see it. It's something worth seeing. If you have not seen the video We Live in Public, I would strongly recommend that people check it out. It would be worthy of a series of YouTube dialogues just about that documentary. Okay, thanks.